Well, James Landale is here. And I see, James, you've printed off a sheath of regal texts.
Yeah, I always like to do that because although you can watch them and that you've really got to watch them just to sort of hear and see the delivery, but also you want to sometimes just go back and count how many times you mentioned NATO and how many jokes there were and things like that. And I'm just old-fashioned. I like a bit of paper rather than constantly scrolling up and down.
It's not on vellum, though, is it?
It's
We
not.
can't stretch to
It's
that
not
in our
on
office.
vellum, but I forgot to bring my vellum notebook with me.
Well, where would you like to start? Would you like to start as sort of theatre critic or as diplomatic correspondent?
Whatever.
Well, let's do theatre critic first, because actually these things are a lot about the performance and the theatre, and there was a load of that in both the speeches, the one to Congress and the one to the state banquet, wasn't there?
What's really interesting is the Congress speech is really hard because of the constant interruption.
Yeah.
Right. Speeches are living, breathing things, are lectures, and they have a rhythm and a pace to them. And when you're sort of rehearsing them, there's I've given a few of my time, not to Congress. There's a sort of flow. But if you deliver a sentence, then suddenly the entire audience stands up and claps for sort of 30 seconds, then sits down again. There's an endless stop-start. And you could see there were a couple of times where the king sort of went, come on, just let me get on.
Yeah, and he has a way of putting his hand up where he's sort of acknowledging it, but also saying, sit down, please.
Yeah. Sit down, you're rocking the boat. And so I think that, there was a little bit of that going on, but he pressed on because sometimes, they interrupted a sentence to applaud. But he was quite clever. I noticed that he would nip back and repeat the previous half sentence before diving into the next one, just to sort of keep the stitch going. So I thought
someone who knows what a soundbite is.
Exactly. And so I thought that was good. The king is very good at delivering jokes. He knows how to do sort of deadpan self-deprecation. He also knows how to keep going when a joke doesn't land, because not every joke lands. There's always a slight sort of gap between English humor and American humor, and however good you are, there are always going to be moments where people just simply won't understand what you're talking about. And there were a couple of occasions where you could tell the audience didn't understand what he was talking about. There's a certain element of irony, of sarcasm that just doesn't quite cross the Atlantic. But by and large, as pieces of theatre, they were well written and well delivered. Landed in a performative way.
And then there was a great bit of theatre in the state banquet speech where he revealed the bell from the submarine that the UK had given Australia in the 1940s. That was the original AUKUS pact, and it was called the HMS Trump.
Yeah,
genius. It's gold. It's got his name on it. It's about it, but it also cemented an alliance that looked a little bit shaky. Ideal.
And the official who discovered that, found it, obtained it, top marks. Absolutely top
Which was
marks.
That's diplomacy, isn't it? Right. Oh, Daniela Relph is on the line. Hi, Daniela.
Hi, Adam.
Where are you right now? And I should just say we've got to about 5 p.m. UK time as we're recording this.
Yes, I am in downtown Manhattan. I am standing at the 9/11 memorial here, which is a really, really moving, somber place to be, waiting for the arrival of the King and Queen, who will be here shortly for their first engagement in New York. So a different tone and a different mood to events today.
Do we know what they're actually going to be doing there, Daniela? Is it going and visiting that there's a sort of big water feature, isn't it? Which is how they've commemorated that.
Yeah, that's what I'm actually just looking down into it now. It's like it's a sort of bit like how you would imagine a reservoir. It's rather beautiful. It's sort of all the water pouring into this central point, and with the names of those almost 3,000 people who died engraved all around the entire memorial. And the King and Queen are coming here. They will lay a wreath here. It is this year 25 years since the 9/11 attacks. So they will also be meeting some of the families who lost loved ones and some of the emergency workers who worked that day. So they'll be spending some time here, as well as meeting local politicians, including the city's Democratic Mayor, Zoran Mamdani.
And James, the King and Queen would never be so disrespectful to try and make a political point out of a giant tragedy for their host country. But thinking back to the King's speech in Congress, he did refer to the international response to 9/11 which was a big international coming together, which was a political point he was making.
Yeah, well, no, he was reminding Congress that that was the one time when Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty was triggered, namely of collective military defence to defend an ally that had been attacked. And he said, he also noted at the same time that the United Nations Security Council also agreed unanimously that they should take military action as a result of that, standing shoulder to shoulder. So yes, he wouldn't make it in situ, but definitely the point was made politically in Congress.
And Daniela, just tell us what sort of vibes you're getting from the palace about how they feel these various speeches have gone down, and in particular the quite political interventions that the king was making at various points, whether it's about the importance of NATO, the importance of Europe and America working together.
I think they're feeling quite pleased with themselves, to be honest. Looking at the expression of some of the palace team's faces during the delivery of the Congress speech yesterday, I think they were pretty pleased with how it has landed and how the king delivered some of those points that you mentioned. I mean, there is no question in my mind, and, like James and I have sat in on a lot of the king's speeches. And sometimes he can get sort of a bit wordy and a bit lost in the anecdote or the historical reference or the literary quote or whatever it is. It can be a little bit dense and a bit hard to kind of pick apart and get to. I mean, that really wasn't the case yesterday. I thought actually the way he stood and delivered the speech was really interesting. I think he was energized. I think he really liked the applause and the standing ovations and the laughs at his gags. I just think the whole thing was a really confident delivery from him, where perhaps it's not always, it doesn't always feel that way. And those around him are very pleased. I think there was a bit of nervousness last night after that reference by the president in the speech at the state dinner about, Charles agrees with me about Iran not having a nuclear weapon. I think because there were a lot of questions to the palace about that. But, they were very clear that they felt this was absolutely fine for the president to say that it was the position is of the UK government, and Yvette Cooper, the Foreign Secretary, was there nodding away as the president said this. So they sort of tried to dilute any questions and controversy around that moment. But I think they are generally just really thrilled with the mood, the look, and how things are being received here.
And James, just decode one of those moments that Daniela was nodding to there in the speech in Congress, where he made a reference to Magna Carta and this idea of checks and balances on executive power, and that got a big laugh in the chamber.
The US Supreme Court Historical Society has calculated that Magna Carta is cited in at least 160 Supreme Court cases since 1789, not least as the foundation of the principle that executive power is subject to checks and balances.
What's your take on what was going on there?
Well, on one level, he was referring back to, core documents that are the foundation of our rule of law that apply equally to the United Kingdom as they do to the United States in terms of, huge, he cited the number of references to Magna Carta and Supreme Court judgments and things like that. So he was talking about the joint heritage of both countries, and the sort of not so subtle point was, we've been around together for a long time. We have a lot of shared culture, and yes, we might have disagreed a lot over the years, but ultimately the reason that the relationship is so important is because it endures despite those the differences. But then suddenly, as you say, he mentioned the importance of, constitutional checks and balances of executive power. And instantly, all the Democrats presumed that was a reference to Donald Trump, because obviously, under the Trump presidency, there has been this thesis, this idea, even an ideology of the accretion of presidential power. In other words, that actually the system of checks and balances that we naturally presume exists in the United States and has done for many, many years, there are many in the MAGA world who challenge that thesis and think actually the law has been misinterpreted and the executive, the president, has far more power than the system lets on.
MAGA Carter, you call it.
Exactly. And that therefore President Trump is, quite right to impose his authority over the courts in a way that previous presidents have done, impose his authority over Congress, and sidesteps Congress by having a number of executive orders, using his very limited fiscal powers over tariffs to almost trump the basic idea, which is that Congress does the money in American politics, and he has pushed that. So the Democrats liked that reference because they thought that was a nod to their comfort zone and their argument that they've been making against the administration.
But Daniela, that bit of the speech in Congress is a classic bit of regal rhetoric, isn't it? Because when you read it in writing, you're like, well, he's not really saying anything there that isn't just a historical fact or just the law of the land in America. He's not doing a gag or a political soundbite there. There's nothing you can really argue with.
Well, yeah, exactly. And as ever with these things, you are hearing what you want to hear from your own position in it, and that was very obvious, as James has touched on, when you watched how various sides of the political divide were responding during the Congress speech. It was very much along party lines at times. You heard what you want to hear. You felt positive depending on what you heard from the King's words. I think as well that in terms of both the times we heard from the King yesterday, I think we have to see it almost as one big speech rather than two separate ones a little bit. It was almost as if that first speech to Congress, that's where the kind of hard and dirty stuff happened, where there was a little bit of a poke and a nudge, and he really sort of delved into the politics in a way that we don't normally see. And then when you got to the evening, that was the bit to make everyone feel better and not to worry too much. There was a lot of stroking of the president, how proud his parents would have been of him. We know how great America is, how important it is. So they really did sort of complement each other and were very much seen as two separate speeches that were very much part of the same project.
And James, I'm thinking back to, Donald Trump hasn't said many controversial things in this visit in the last few days, but he said a lot of controversial things about Britain's role in the world in the recent past. For example, British troops not being at the front line in the fight in Afghanistan. The King sort of responded to quite a lot of that stuff in his own way as well, didn't he?
Well, simply by reminding the fact that British and American forces have fought alongside each other throughout history.
His own family.
He cited his own family. He cited, he referred to his own service in the Royal Navy after Donald Trump referred to some Britain's two aircraft carriers as toys. He did name check Afghanistan, and certainly, if you talk to diplomats, they say that. When Donald Trump made those remarks, they said it was made, the King's displeasure was made clear through, discreet back channels. That was seen as one of the reasons why the president, conducted a reverse ferret on that pretty fast. Because that displeasure was there. And the thing is, for the palace, that's a real, when you deploy a little bit of political capital like that, it's very judicious. I mean, Danielle will tell you that, when has the King done this? Very, very rarely. That was one occasion, perhaps. Another was over Canada, when Donald Trump sort of, made acquisitive noises over Canada. There people were inferring why the King is wearing a sort of Canadian flag, and suddenly Canadians are being invited to Sandringham, and then things. Do you know what I mean? There are ways that messages can be conveyed.
Daniela?
Yes, the other thing that actually struck me on a more personal note in the King, in terms of when we're looking for things that perhaps have upset him, his talk of his personal faith during the speech, I think, was really important, because we know from those working around him that there is a degree of discomfort from the King in the way the conversation around religion at the White House has played out, particularly with the Pope and the relationship between President Trump and what he has said about the Pope. And I think there is definite upset on the King's side about that. And it was interesting to me that he chose to give a pretty chunky amount of time to talking about the importance of his own faith, of diversity in faith, of understanding how other people think, about kindness, I suppose, and that was very personal, but also in a slightly different way to some of the harder politics, quite pointed.
And Daniela, you could see the political differences across the Atlantic playing out in one bit in particular in the congressional speech, which is when he talks about his passion for nature and protecting the environment. And J.D. Vance, the vice president, who was basically sort of the chair of the event, did not clap.
No, it was quite silent generally at that point compared to other moments during the speech. But yeah, J.D. Vance in particular did not look at all pleased with that element of the speech, and was very, it was just sort of, you just couldn't really read him. It was like nothing to see here. But yeah, that element, I would say, probably the environment, the nature parts of what he had to say to Congress, probably with the bits that didn't land quite as well as others.
Quite the opposite of drill, baby, drill. James, you're flicking through your sheaf of non-vellum documents. Anything else you want to flag to us?
Well, the thing that impressed me most, or as in it was impressed upon me most, was just the sheer ruthless, relentless riposte to Trumpism that these speeches involved. Amidst all the charm and the flattery and the jokes and the humour and the praise and the joint history and all the rest of it, this was the king speaking up for alliances. This was alliances first, not America first. He spoke up in favour of NATO, in favour of Europe, in favour of the Commonwealth. He praised international law, international rules that this administration have overtly, rhetorically and in practice, completely denigrated. He made it absolutely clear and said that you cannot take on the world's challenges one nation alone. And the point is that is the complete opposite of what Donald Trump does and says. And I think he was able to make that argument, and the fact that he was able to make that argument without the administration reacting to it was, I thought, amazing, because very few politicians ever come near to that. And of course, the king's not a politician, but in terms of making an argument in favour, and it wasn't just the environmental stuff. It was a piece by piece, block by block argument against the core ideology of Donald Trump and his administration. And I think the real test for this trip is not, does Donald Trump's genuine warmth and affection for the king sort of begin to smooth over some of the cracks between the two governments. I think it's, does the White House allow some of these arguments to sink in? Do they think, actually, hang on a minute, there is an advantage here? Do we need to think differently because of the way the whole Iran thing's gone? Do we need to think differently about alliances, blah, blah, blah? Do we need to, if America, for example, wants to focus on China and a bit on the Middle East, is it not better to have allies in Europe kind of doing what the Americans want, sort of on as a form of an alliance? Now, the realist will go, this trip's not going to make a blind bit of notice. And a difference, and that actually Donald Trump will carry on being Donald Trump, and this is separate. This is about the soft soap and the emotion, and it doesn't touch the American concerns over lack of British military firepower at the moment. But I thought that was the interesting question: is does the White House think the president likes the king? The king makes an argument. Should we therefore listen to that argument? I don't know the answer to that question yet.
Yeah, Daniela, what's your take on that? Because it's about what's this visit meant to achieve? Because sometimes it feels like, it was just meant to achieve not going wrong and not being a disaster and Trump not blowing it all up. But then also sometimes it seems like, this was about trying to move to a new page of UK-US relations. But then equally, some people saying, this was an attempt to try and change Donald Trump's mind about like how he engages with the world. What's your take and Buckingham Palace's take as well on just what they were sort of trying to get out of this?
Well, we've been told a number of times by some of the diplomats involved in setting up the trip and working on the planning that they do not view this as a reset, and they don't like that kind of language. They've also said that the government didn't go into this trip with big objectives to come out the other end, like we often have on these state visits around trade and things, that there aren't big objectives here. it is much more, as we know, about the mood music and how everyone feels about each other and the state of the relationship. But it's interesting listening there, because the thing that strikes me about a state visit is sometimes it definitely doesn't cover up the cracks. It really highlights where the joins are splitting, I suppose, in many ways. And it doesn't. And I feel that has done this a bit, because when you look at the two men as individuals, I mean, have the King and Donald Trump ever felt further apart as they do at the moment? You have this brash, shoots from the hip, kind of, loves the cameras, loves the attention kind of president, with this quiet, really restrained, really thinks very carefully about everything he says, human being. They are just polar opposites. And I think ultimately the job here was just to try and soften the edges of that relationship and try and find a way that perhaps others working with them can now move forward more politically and diplomatically. But I mean, it has really struck me that it hasn't necessarily brought people together. It's just really emphasized, how different both administrations are.
And Daniela, just the Jeffrey Epstein situation, how is that being addressed, either indirectly or directly?
Yeah, it isn't really. There was that very short line in the Congress speech yesterday about victims of society's ills, which was, we are told by Buckingham Palace, a reference to victims of sexual abuse. So that was the closest that the King has come to any direct reference to Jeffrey Epstein or his victims and survivors. So, I mean, it isn't being addressed, as the Palace has said, that it isn't that they don't want to, it's just that they can't, because legal advice says that should they step in and lean into the Epstein conversation while they are here, that there is a chance it could jeopardize the legal process for the victims who are still in pursuit of justice around that.
And then, Daniela, the US part of the visit is drawing to a close soon, and then the King and Queen get on separate planes.
They do, yeah. We've got this day in New York today where just a day trip here where the King will have the 9/11 memorial. The King then goes up to Harlem, and the Queen is going to New York Public Library, where she'll be there with the author Harlan Coben and the actress Sarah Jessica Parker at a literary event there. Then the final day in Washington tomorrow, there'll be a big goodbye in the morning. And then the King and Queen will do some events that are more public facing in Virginia, which will be a sort of different mood. There'll be walkabouts, they're going to a block party. And so a different, I think the sort of bit of the tension will have eased tomorrow. And yet then for the King, it is Bermuda, a British overseas territory. He'll spend a couple of days there in the sunshine on events around the environment, around cultural ties and community engagement.
Oh, well, Daniela, thank you very much for bringing us up to date, and thanks for fitting in newscaster, and you've got so many other bits of the BBC to do as well, so thank you.
Always here for you, Adam.
Oh, thank you. Are you a big Harlan Coben fan, James? Mid-range thrillers?
Yeah, I'm more a Jack Reacher guy.
That's another kind of mid-range thriller, though, isn't it?
Yeah, in that genre, that's where I sort of land.
And of course, Sarah Jessica Parker was the judge of the Booker Prize, wasn't she? So it's not just random showbiz. There's a literary element.
I think she's probably better known for other roles.
Now, in other institutions based on primogeniture, today is a big day in parliamentary history in the UK, isn't it? Because the last hereditary peers, so the people who inherit their titles from their dads and then get to sit in the House of Lords as a result, are going. They've been chucked out.
It does feel like an end of an era. It's certainly an end of an era in my career, because many, many years ago, I was the House of Lords correspondent for the Times newspaper.
Remember it well.
And I spent a lot of time there talking to hereditary peers. But what was interesting was during the Blair election of 97, the two things that always got I was on Blair's bus, and the two things that always got a big cheer was getting rid of the royal yacht, which was considered a waste in those days, and the royal family was very popular in those days. And secondly, getting rid of hereditary peers. That was seen as a sort of, it was a sort of physical manifestation of oldness that New Labour was the solution to. And then I remember them all telling me, "Oh, we're going to get rid of the whole House of Lords. We're going to get rid of all the flummery and all this." And of course, the moment they got in, they fell in love with it and sort of rather liked it, as everybody always does.
And then realised they could create their own peers too.
And could create their own peers. And I remember, and then so Tony Blair sort of set off to sort of get rid of the hereditary peers. And then, of course, the peers brilliantly fought a rearguard action, as the British aristocracy had done ever since the early 1800s, during the Reform Acts and all those, where they ceded power inch by inch, bill by bill, from the Reform Acts, and then up to the legislation in the early 1900s when the House of Lords had some of its powers constrained, and all of this sort of thing. And exactly the same thing happened in the late 1990s. And Tony Blair thought he was getting rid of all the hereditaries then, but a guy called at the time, his name was Robert Cranborne, Lord Cranborne. He's now Robert Salisbury, or Lord Salisbury, and he was the leader of the Conservative leader in the House of Lords. And this was the era when William Hague was Prime Minister, and he basically did.
No, William Hague was leader of the opposition. Wanted to be Prime Minister.
Wanted to be Prime Minister, exactly. And Robert Cranborne, as he then was, basically went behind William Hague's back and did a private deal with Downing Street and Blair, when basically said, "Okay, we will eventually let your reforms through, but you are going to save 92 hereditaries who are going to carry on." And he did this deal without telling Hague, and so Hague had to sack him. Robert Cranborne famously said in his statement to the media that I have been behaving like I have run in like an ill-trained spaniel, which is a shooting reference that needed some explanation to the wider audience. But what was fascinating about it was the reason Blair gave in to that was because he was just so bored of the whole thing. There was a story I remember once about how it was being brought. This issue was being brought up again at cabinet, and Blair started publicly yawning because he found the whole thing so boring. But that's why the hereditaries have survived for so long, and here we all are, and they're only now leaving Parliament.
Yeah, and I also I can imagine people going, "Oh, why do you even care about this?" But I just think it's a metaphor for like why people. It's easy to say you'll modernise our state, but actually the reality of doing that is much harder, and can take a lot longer than anyone thought. Maybe even like 30 years.
I have written so many stories about House of Lords reform, about turning it into a regional representative body, a national representative body, a body that has different elections, different electoral systems, different all of these things. And we have gone round the houses endless time. And you know what? It just never happens. And all that happens is it just gets bigger and bigger, and more people pile in.
Well, yeah, because it's just a perfect kind of petri dish of conservatism versus radicalism versus realism, isn't it? All the things we're actually discussing in our coverage of the King's speech. James, thank you very much for bringing us up to date with that long-running story.
Thank you.
Now, as promised, we're going to catch up with BBC business editor Simon Jack, who's written a piece for the BBC News website today on the in-depth section about some of the little tremors some people are noticing in the world economy right now. So here's my conversation from earlier with Simon Jack. Hello, Simon.
Hello, Adam.
What made you think back to 2008?
So I remember covering that, and
I think we all do.
Well, yes, I mean, I didn't think I'd ever cover a bigger story in my life, and of course, then we had COVID, blah blah blah. Anyway, the point is that before the kind of earthquake that happened in 2008 and Lehman Brothers going bust and the world going into a financial crisis, there were a couple of tremors that happened before that. And some of the tremors that happened then, some people have identified as happening now. So you've got three things going on which have echoes of that time. One is you've got surging energy costs. Back in 2007, you saw very high rising energy prices. You had the stress in some parts of the financial system. Back then, it was a couple of funds that were investing in subprime mortgages suddenly closed down and said investors couldn't get their money out. Right now, you see a couple of things called private credit, which I'm sure we'll get into and what that is, saying you can't have all your money out. It's a bit like a slow motion run on a bank, like Northern Rock, for example, which was in September 2007. And then you had also some stretch valuations. You had the stock market at or near all-time highs. Now, you look at the financial headlines now, they look a bit like that. You've got surging energy prices, you've got distress in some of the financial system, and you've got what some people call stretch valuations in terms of particularly the amount of money that's going into AI. Now, if you add all of those things together, do you have the ingredients for another financial crisis, and how might it resemble the one in 2008? And I've been speaking to the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, other people, Mohammed El Erian, esteemed economist, and they say they do see some echoes of that. And, they agree there are some risks which are being underappreciated.
Okay, so you spelled out the three kind of tremors there. Let's look at each one individually and try and work out what they each mean. The first one, oil prices. I suppose actually that's quite simple to get your head around, isn't it?
Yep.
Because that's just, we've been talking about it a lot because of the Strait of Hormuz. We now know actually these things take a while to filter down and they can pop up in all sorts of different bits of the economy rather than just things that are dominated by oil.
Yes, exactly. And what they tend to do is push inflation generally up, which in turn can begin to push interest rates up, and rising interest rates place stress on the financial system because basically it makes it more expensive for businesses to borrow. Rising inflation at the same time takes money out of people's pockets. It's generally a bad thing.
Because I know I'm sometimes guilty of this, of like I see a headline about oil prices going up and I think, well, I don't have a car, so I don't have to worry about the price of petrol. But then I realize that's a very naive view of how the global economy works. I do eat food, yes, sometimes quite a lot of it. No, exactly. So then my second thought is, no, I am directly affected by this. So then the second tremor you were talking about was this whole thing about private markets. Now that is almost like a label designed to make you switch off and go, oh, that sounds boring. But just explain what that actually is and what's going on in these markets.
Okay, so after the financial crisis of 2008-9, banks had lots of rules applied to them, so they couldn't get into risky lending. So they were much more cautious about lending money. And now into that void sprung up a whole new industry where basically rather than banks lending money, these funds would collect money and they would lend directly to businesses. They're like mimicking banks, and they're called non-banks or sometimes shadow banks. So that is private credit. And this industry has grown from zero in 2008 to about $2.5 trillion today. And because they are not banks, they're not regulated in the same way as banks, and no one really quite has a microscope on them, so no one really knows what they're doing. But they are lending money at a pace to lots of companies, and the fear is that some of the money that goes into these funds, which then gets lent onto business, is borrowed in the first place itself. So you have what they call, the debt is leverage, they call it. And so you've got this layer cake of leverage upon leverage. And when you have all those things going on, they can interact in really unpredictable ways.
That really reminds me of 2008.
Leverage upon leverage upon leverage. So you've got private credit, which is misunderstood, poorly regulated, pretty opaque, quite complex, and very likely highly leveraged. And it's never been tested, this new market, through a distressing time, which is what we potentially have now.
And just in terms of the name for it, private credit, when we say the word private, that sort of makes us think of like rich individuals or rich families, but it's not that, is it? They're not the source of the credit of the funds.
No, there are some institutions like pension funds who'll put a bit of money into private credit, but there are also retail investors, particularly in the US, who will say, "Oh, I'm going to put some money into that." And that's where the stress has been. We've seen that because there's a couple of Blue Owl, BlackRock, Apollo. These are quite big names in the US, and some of them have retail investors who've seen some of these scares and now want their money out. And what we've seen is it's a bit like a slow motion run on a bank. They want their money out. But the point is that the money they want out has already been lent to somebody else.
That's what leverage is.
And just like a bank.
Yeah.
And so they've had, some of those funds have either had to say, sorry, you can't have your money out. You want all your money out, you can have 5% of it now, you can have 5% of it, blah, blah, blah. Or they've marked up big losses, in some cases gated their funds completely, which means like, I'm sorry, until further notice, you can't get your money out. Now, of course, when people see that, and because, well, I better get my money, you know what I mean? Those things, like we see a run on a bank, it's like a slow motion one of those. And that is the distress we're seeing in the private credit market. Now, private credit is quite small compared to the overall market, but it's as big now as the US subprime mortgage market was in 2008.
Right. Just because it's small doesn't mean it doesn't have tentacles that spread out in other places.
Correct, because once people think you've got some nasties that, lurking somewhere, they go, well, I might not, I'm Bank A, I might not lend money to Bank B, because I think Bank B has lent money to one of these private credit funds, and I don't know what. So all, it's basically the fearful whispers get around. Now, we're not at that stage yet. I want to make that
Just to be clear, yeah.
Perfectly clear. But, is there distress in some parts of the financial system? Yes, there is. And a lot of people talk about it. Now, no, I did an interview a couple of weeks ago with Larry Fink, who's the world's biggest money manager. He runs BlackRock. And he says, I see zero similarities with 2007. Just put that on the record. A lot of people saying there's nothing to see here. Other people say, it's not enough to bring down the financial system, but it's a risk which is flashing on the dashboard.
And also, it's always worth remembering back to 2008. Before 2008, there was 2007, obviously, which is when we had what was known as the credit crunch, when banks stopped lending to each other.
Correct.
And people sort of conflate the credit crunch and the global financial crisis, but actually there was two separate bits there, weren't there?
Well, the credit crunch, in a way, sort of brought about the financial crisis, because once you shut off the supply of credit, banks aren't like normal companies. They're like the bloodstream of the economy. They make sure that wages get paid, that companies can borrow money, that things get financed, all that kind of stuff. So if banks get sort of infected and sclerotic, the whole body economy sort of seizes up. Now, the good news is, right now, is the banks, because of the lessons we learned in 2008, are much better capitalized. They've got much more shock-absorbing capital. They're not so, it takes much more to knock them off their perch than it did today. And it's not, and private credit on its own, I don't think would be enough to bring about the kind of crisis we saw back in 2008. But there are other factors.
And then the third kind of tremor you were identifying is, the valuation of bits of the economy, and in this case, tech companies, and in particular, how much they've spent on AI, which is eye-wateringly, mind-bogglingly enormous.
Well, they've spent about $2 trillion on pouring money into AI, and a lot of that has been focused on quite a few big companies. And here's a staggering statistic. We have this thing called the S&P 500, which is an index of the 500 biggest publicly traded companies in America. Now, the entire value of the S&P 500, 35 to 40% of it is concentrated in 7 companies, and they are the ones that you would expect: Nvidia, Microsoft, Amazon, etc. Google, well, the parent company Alphabet. So whether people like it or not, even people who put their money in index trackers or whatever, and a lot of people in the US do that, and a lot of pension funds here in the UK have
because you can just buy a fund that matches the price of that index.
And you think, well, I've got a nice diversified portfolio, I'm tracking 500 companies. Well, actually, whether you like it or not, you're taking a pretty big one-way bet on the future of AI. And that, with the tons of money going into it, lots of people have said a lot of that money will end up wasted. Yes, it's going to change the world. That doesn't mean, just like the railroad changed the world, doesn't mean there wasn't some massive busts there along the way. Just like we had the dot-com boom and then bust. The NASDAQ, tech-heavy NASDAQ, back in 2001, lost 80% of its value in about a year and a half's time. Now, no one is suggesting that's going to happen. But once again, if you were to get, somebody just the market changing its mind, we've all got a bit too excited about AI, we don't think it's going to get the returns to justify this investment. If you get a fall in that, you get a fall in overall stock markets, and that dents confidence and just adds the overall sense of uncertainty.
And as part of your kind of look at all of this stuff, you spoke to Sarah Breeden, the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, who's kind of, her job is stability. So she must be thinking about this a lot.
Yeah, she does. And she says, look, and again, she says there's none of these single risks is enough to create a 2008 style crisis. But what she said in her own words, and you can go back and listen to this, is that what keeps me awake at night is the risk of all these different things crystallizing at the same time, and whether the financial system is resilient enough to cope with it. Now, again, she says that the real thing that can infect the whole economy is if the banks start going bad. And she says the banks are in much better shape. So that's the good news. The bad news is the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, concerned for financial stability, is being kept awake
Well,
at
I was
night.
going to say, like, if you're a regulator, okay, she's not a regulator in the strict sense of things, but she is a
She's one of them.
She's a guardian.
Yeah.
Being kept awake at night. I mean, maybe there are other things going on in their household. I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is a concerning thing for her to have said.
Yeah, so I think the verdict is, in a way, is that, you know, there's no one single risk which poses the same kind of risk that the banking crisis did for the world economy. But there are the ingredients there that, if combined, could create a pretty severe financial and economic shock to the world economy. And it comes at a time when, if you cast your mind back to 2008, 2009, Gordon Brown, for example, Alistair Darling, they were one of the leaders of what was an international response to that crisis. They did things like they would cut interest rates at the same time in different countries. They would bail out banks at the same time. It was very coordinated. Let's all get round a table, both government and central banks, and try and fix this in a kind of, you know, howitzer kind of way. We're going to, you know, throw the kitchen sink at this. I think with, you know, geopolitical tensions, with trade tensions, with China versus the US kind of tensions, the idea of the world coming together to tackle a financial crisis is much harder to imagine now than it was back then.
And also, there's going to be a big newcomer on the world financial scene with the new head of the Fed in America. Just tell us a bit more about him and what his mindset is.
So his name is Kevin Warsh. He's Donald Trump's pick to be the next Fed governor, and he's gone through the first hurdle of being appointed. Now, he is somebody who is not a fan of printing money indiscriminately to basically bail out everyone. He thinks that when you print money, what you do is that you can stoke inflation, and when you've got high oil prices, you don't want to be doing that. And second, that what it does is artificially it inflates the value of assets. And what that does is the people who the haves get, you know, have more in terms of people who own assets.
Yeah.
So it actually stokes inequality. So he is, you know,
it's good for people who are already on the housing ladder, but not great for people who want to get on it.
Exactly.
Recent history has shown.
So his ideology, what we know of it so far, is that he's much less inclined to sort of start the printing presses of money, to kind of flood the market with new printed money, which helped back then. He's much less likely to do that than his predecessor, Ben Bernanke, at that time. And therefore, we can't rely on that particular hosepipe. And as Mohamed El-Erian, esteemed economist and chief economic advisor to a German alliance, and used to be the head of the world's biggest bond investor, so he knows what he's talking about. He said it's a bit like a fire brigade that's run out of water, because he points that if you look at government's ability to intervene, look what we've been through. Well, the bailout of the banks and all the stuff we just talked about. We then had COVID, where we were paying millions of people's wages. You then had the last energy crisis, where energy bills were being subsidised. In 2008, debt in the UK as a percentage of the whole economy, the national income, was 40%. It's now 100%, pretty much. So the government's ability to respond has been eroded much more.
And I know you're not being a Cassandra here. You're just pointing out some of the things that people are saying and some of the potential consequences. But it does still surprise me that things like the American stock market has gone back to exactly where it was, if not higher than it was before the war in the Gulf.
Yeah.
The war which is not over yet. And most of the economic consequences have not actually been felt in real life yet.
Yeah, so that is absolutely staggering. And this is a point that I put directly to Sarah Breeden, the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England. I said, hang on a second, a macroeconomic shock. So that means something that really shocks the financial system. An energy crisis is it. Don't forget that Fatih Birol, who's the boss of the International Energy Agency, said that what we're seeing now, the ongoing shut of the Strait of Hormuz, is the biggest energy shock we've seen in our lifetime. Worse than 1973.
Doesn't he say it's like all the other ones added
All the
together?
other ones put together. He does say that.
Like everyone who's ever been alive hasn't experienced cumulatively what we're about to go through now.
He does say that. And at the same time, you say the stock market it's actually set an all-time high, earlier this week or at the end of last week. So again, the similarities come in, stocks at or near all-time highs, surging energy prices, potential, economic shock there, stretch valuations. And what was interesting about Sarah Breeden, I sort of pushed her, she said, I expect to see an adjustment in stock markets. I said, when you say adjustment, do you mean stocks go down?
Yeah.
She said, yes, I do mean stocks go down. Now, that's pretty unusual language for a central banker. Usually they talk in code. Alan Greenspan's favourite expression was, irrational exuberance,
Yes.
was what we said, or the risks are to the downside, all that kind of stuff. She actually said, I expect stock markets to go down because they're not fully reflecting the number of risks that we've just talked about are being reflected in those prices.
And also talking about bankers talking in code, there's an interest rate decision tomorrow, is there?
There is.
So we'll get some more code from the Bank of England.
We will get some code.
And when I say tomorrow, I mean Thursday, because we're recording this on Wednesday.
Yes, on Thursday. And it's a toss-up at the moment. I think the prevailing betting is that they will keep interest rates unchanged because often bankers try and look through what they see as short-term volatility, saying, okay, what's going to happen in 6 months or 9 months or whatever. And so they'll try and look through this. But, there's a lot of people thinking that this war, the US, the Pentagon and the White House thinking what was going on in Iran would be over by now. It is still resolutely shut, the Strait of Hormuz. So, we'll see. And also we got a Federal Reserve rate decision, the central bank in the US, also later this week. So lots of data points. And could I just also point out,
Yes.
just after around 9 p.m. on Wednesday tonight, we will get earnings from Microsoft, Nvidia, Amazon, and others, 4 of the big 7, if you like. And that will be seen. Everyone is literally holding their breath because, as Bloomberg put it, the fate of the entire stock market now depends on how these companies do. So every single thing they say is being watched minutely. So by the time you're hearing this, we'll probably know a bit more.
We could all be richer or poorer.
Yes.
Simon, thank you very much. We're definitely richer for listening to you intellectually.
Thank you, Adam. Nice to be here.